I didn't cry when I read my husband's message. I simply looked around the house and wondered which stranger would be living in it next. The text arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning while I was folding a light blue dress I had planned to wear on our anniversary trip. 40 years of marriage, and Richard had promised we would celebrate somewhere warm, somewhere near the ocean. I had already checked the weather in Santa Barbara. 72 degrees and sunshine. Perfect for a walk along the pier. My suitcase sat open on the bed, half packed. A pair of comfortable walking shoes. A paperback novel. The pearl necklace Richard gave me on our 20th anniversary. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. I remember smiling before I picked it up, expecting a simple message like "Don't forget your sunglasses" or "Traffic might be bad this afternoon." Instead, I read 5 words that felt oddly calm on the screen. "I'm taking my mistress instead." For a moment I thought I had misunderstood. I read it again. The same 5 words. No explanation. No apology. Just a short sentence delivered with the same casual tone someone might use to cancel dinner reservations. I sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at the suitcase. The blue dress rested neatly on top of everything else. I folded it again, slower this time, and placed it back in the closet. Outside the bedroom window, the maple tree in our front yard swayed gently in the morning breeze. Richard planted that tree the year our son Daniel started kindergarten. He had said it would grow alongside our family. I remember laughing when the trunk was barely thicker than a broom handle. Now it stood taller than the roof of the house. Funny how time works like that. Some things grow quietly for decades while other things disappear before you even notice they're gone. I set my phone down on the nightstand and walked through the hallway. Our house was a modest 2-story place in a quiet Ohio suburb, about 15 minutes from the lake. We bought it 35 years ago for $120,000. At the time it felt enormous to us. 3 bedrooms, a wide kitchen, and a backyard big enough for Daniel to build snowmen every winter. I ran my hand along the wooden banister Richard had installed himself. One summer. He spent 3 weekends sanding and staining that wood. Said he wanted something solid that would last. The living room still smelled faintly of the lemon polish I used every Sunday morning. Family photos lined the mantel. Daniel at age 8 holding a baseball trophy. Our vacation in Colorado, all of us squinting under bright mountain sunlight. And our wedding portrait, framed in gold, Richard standing beside me with his arm around my shoulders. We looked so certain about the future in that photograph. I stood there for a long time, just looking. No anger. No shouting. Just a quiet realization settling into the room like dust in a beam of sunlight. My husband had chosen someone else to take on the trip that was supposed to celebrate our life together. I picked up my phone again and read the message one more time. Still the same 5 words. Still just as simple. I didn't reply. Instead, I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a cup of coffee. The clock above the stove read 9:14 a.m. I remember thinking that by this time tomorrow Richard would probably be checking into a hotel with someone who had never planted a tree in our yard, never painted these walls, never watched our son learn to ride a bicycle on the driveway outside. I took a slow sip of coffee and looked around the kitchen. The cabinets I repainted 2 summers ago. The refrigerator covered in magnets from places we had visited over the years. Every corner of that house held a piece of my life. And in that quiet moment, standing alone in the kitchen with sunlight spilling across the floor, I realized something Richard clearly had not thought about at all. The house he had just walked away from was not in his name. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment after that thought settled in. The house was not in his name. Richard had never questioned it when we bought the place all those years ago. Back then he was busy working 60 hours a week at the manufacturing plant, and I handled the paperwork. The bank officer had looked at both of us across the desk and asked how we wanted the title arranged. Richard had shrugged and said, "Put it in Margaret's name. She takes care of these things better than I do." At the time it meant nothing. Just another small decision in a long list of adult responsibilities. But standing there in the quiet kitchen decades later, it suddenly meant everything. I walked over to the refrigerator and took down a magnet from Colorado that held a stack of old receipts. Underneath them was a small envelope where I sometimes kept spare grocery money. The envelope had not moved in months. I slid it aside and leaned against the counter. My phone remained on the table behind me, still showing that message. 5 words that had ended a 40-year marriage without even bothering to explain why. I imagined Richard sitting somewhere at an airport with that woman. Perhaps they were laughing. Perhaps she was impressed that he was taking her on a trip that was supposed to celebrate his marriage. The thought did not make me angry. It made me curious. Curious about how someone could erase 4 decades so easily. I finished my coffee and rinsed the mug in the sink. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice and then the street went quiet again. Tuesday mornings in our neighborhood were always like this. Most people were at work. The school buses had already passed. The world moved forward as if nothing unusual had happened at all. I walked slowly back through the living room and sat down in Richard's favorite armchair. The leather creaked softly under my weight. He liked this chair because it faced the television and the front window at the same time. Said it gave him the best view of everything. From where I sat, I could see the driveway where he had just left that morning with his suitcase. He had told me he needed to leave early to catch his flight. I remembered standing at the door and wishing him a safe trip. I even reminded him to bring a light jacket because evenings near the ocean could be cool. He had kissed my cheek before walking out. Not a long kiss. Just the quick polite kind people exchange out of habit. Now I understood why it felt so distant. I looked around the room again, noticing small details that had once felt ordinary. The scratch on the coffee table from when Daniel dropped his skateboard in the house. The faded corner of the rug where sunlight had touched it for years. All the quiet evidence of a life that had been built one ordinary day at a time. And suddenly a strange calm settled over me. Richard had made his choice this morning. He had walked out the door believing he was leaving everything behind for something new. But he had forgotten one simple fact about the life we built together. The walls around me. The roof above my head. The mortgage that had been paid off 10 years earlier. All of it belonged to me. I reached for my phone again, not to answer Richard's message, but to open my contacts list. There was a name there I had not called in a long time. A woman named Linda Harper. She had helped us buy this house 35 years ago when she was a young real estate agent just starting her career. I remembered she had once told me that property values in our neighborhood would rise steadily because of the lake and the good schools nearby. At the time Richard laughed and said we would probably live here forever anyway. I tapped Linda's number and held the phone to my ear while it rang. As I listened to the soft buzzing sound on the line, I looked once more around the house. The quiet rooms. The framed photographs. The life Richard believed he could leave behind with a single text message. When Linda finally answered, her voice sounded older but still warm and professional. "Margaret Whitmore," she said after I introduced myself. "I have not heard from you in years." I smiled slightly and looked out the window at the maple tree Richard planted decades ago. "Neither had I," I said calmly. "But I think it might be time to sell a house." I held the phone against my ear while Linda spoke, and for the first time that morning I felt something close to momentum. Not anger. Not revenge. Just the quiet sense that a door had opened and I had finally noticed it. Linda asked me a few simple questions the way experienced real estate agents always do. "How many bedrooms?" "3, I said. "Square footage?" "Around 2,200. "Condition of the property?" "Well maintained. I have taken care of it myself for years." She paused for a moment and then said something that made me glance slowly around the kitchen again. "Margaret, houses near the lake have been selling very quickly this year. Families are moving out from the city. You might be surprised what buyers are willing to pay." I thanked her and told her she was welcome to stop by that afternoon if she had time. She agreed without hesitation. After the call ended, I placed the phone gently on the counter and stood there for a moment listening to the silence of the house. It was strange how calm everything felt. 40 years of marriage had ended with a message that took less than 3 seconds to read, yet the world outside the window continued exactly the same as before. The maple tree swayed. A car drove slowly past the house. Somewhere down the street a lawn mower started humming. I walked upstairs to the bedroom and looked again at the suitcase sitting open on the bed. Inside were the clothes I had packed for a trip that was no longer mine. I lifted the paperback novel and placed it back on the nightstand. Then I carried the suitcase into the closet and slid it onto the shelf. The blue dress returned to its hanger beside several others I had worn to family gatherings over the years. Thanksgiving dinners. Daniel's college graduation. Richard's retirement party. I ran my fingers lightly across the fabric and realized something that surprised me. I did not feel embarrassed. I did not feel abandoned. What I felt instead was a quiet clarity that had probably been waiting for a long time. Because once I allowed myself to think about it, the message from Richard was not the beginning of anything. It was the final piece of a pattern that had been forming slowly for years. I remembered the evenings he claimed he needed to stay late at the office long after he had already retired. I remembered the business conferences that seemed to happen more often once Daniel moved out and the house became quieter. At the time I accepted those explanations because marriage often runs on trust more than evidence. But standing in the closet that morning, every small memory began sliding into place like pieces of a puzzle finally completing itself. Richard had not suddenly changed overnight. He had simply stopped hiding it very well. I walked back downstairs and opened the front door. The air outside smelled like fresh grass and early summer sunshine. I stepped onto the porch and looked across the yard. The maple tree cast a long shadow across the lawn that Richard once insisted on mowing himself every Saturday morning. For decades that yard had been part of our routine. Coffee at 8. Lawn mower at 9. Football on television by afternoon. Ordinary rhythms that once defined our life together. Now those rhythms felt distant, like scenes from a story that had already ended. Around 3 o'clock a silver sedan pulled into the driveway. Linda Harper stepped out carrying a slim leather folder and a warm professional smile. Her hair was shorter than I remembered and now streaked with gray, but her eyes were sharp in the same confident way they had been decades ago when she handed us the keys to this house for the first time. She walked up the path and shook my hand firmly. "Margaret," she said kindly, "it has been a long time." I invited her inside and she paused just beyond the doorway, looking around the living room with the careful attention of someone who understands property the way a historian understands buildings. She walked slowly from room to room, making quiet notes while I followed a few steps behind. Finally she stopped near the window that faced the street and turned toward me. "I believe you were right to call me," she said thoughtfully. "Houses like this do not stay on the market very long anymore." I looked around the room one more time. The photographs. The furniture. The long history held inside those walls. Then I met her eyes and spoke with the same calm voice I had used all morning. "Good," I said. "Because I would like it sold before my husband comes back." I watched Linda Harper close her leather folder slowly, the way professionals do when they have already reached a decision in their mind. She walked toward the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard for a long moment before speaking again. "Margaret," she said carefully, "homes like this usually attract buyers very quickly, especially this close to the lake. Families want quiet streets. Good schools. Space for their children to grow up." I nodded because I already knew she was right. That had been the reason Richard and I bought this house all those years ago. We wanted stability. We wanted roots. Funny how easily people forget the things they once worked so hard to build. Linda turned back toward me with a thoughtful expression. "If we move quickly," she continued, "we can list it by tomorrow morning. With the right price it might not even stay on the market for a week." I looked at the kitchen table where my phone still rested beside the empty coffee mug from earlier that morning. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, Richard was probably walking along a beach with the woman he had chosen to take on our anniversary trip. He likely believed he would come home to the same quiet street and the same familiar house waiting for him. The same photographs on the walls. The same chair in the living room. The same wife who had always been there before. I folded my hands together on the table and spoke calmly. Then we should not waste any time. Linda smiled in the confident way people do when a plan begins to take shape. She opened her folder again and spread several forms across the table. The paperwork looked almost identical to the documents we signed decades ago when we first bought the place. Lines for signatures. Property descriptions. Listing agreements. Life often circles back in ways that feel strangely familiar. While she explained the process, I walked through the house once more, this time seeing it through the eyes of someone preparing to leave rather than someone who expected to stay forever. The living room looked warm in the afternoon light. The staircase carried faint marks from years of footsteps. Even the small crack in the hallway ceiling that Richard once promised to fix seemed almost meaningful now. Every home collects little imperfections over time. They become part of its story. When I returned to the kitchen, Linda had finished preparing the listing documents. She slid a pen across the table toward me. The number printed on the page surprised me slightly. Houses in this neighborhood had increased in value far more than I realized. According to Linda's estimate, the property was now worth nearly 4 times what we paid for it. I studied the number for a moment and then signed my name slowly and carefully. Margaret Whitmore. The same name that appeared on the original title. The same name Richard had casually suggested placing on the paperwork decades earlier without giving it much thought. Linda collected the documents and stacked them neatly into her folder again. Tomorrow morning, she said, I will have the listing online and the sign in the yard. If the interest is strong, we may have offers within a few days. I thanked her and walked her to the front door. As she stepped onto the porch, she paused beside the old maple tree and looked up at its branches. That tree has grown beautifully, she said. I smiled faintly. Yes, I answered, it has had a lot of time to grow. After her car disappeared down the street, I remained on the porch for a while, watching the quiet neighborhood settle into the soft light of early evening. Nothing about the street had changed. The same houses. The same sidewalks. The same peaceful silence that had filled this place for decades. But inside those walls behind me, something had already begun to shift. Richard had sent 5 careless words that morning without realizing they had quietly unlocked the door to everything he believed he owned. And by tomorrow morning a simple white sign would stand in the front yard announcing something he had not imagined when he boarded that airplane. This house was officially for sale. The next morning I woke earlier than usual, just as the first light of dawn began to spread softly through the curtains. For a moment I lay still in bed listening to the quiet rhythm of the house. The refrigerator hummed faintly in the kitchen downstairs. A bird tapped lightly somewhere near the window. Ordinary sounds that had been part of my mornings for decades. Yet everything felt slightly different now, as if the house itself understood that its story was about to change. I rose slowly and walked to the window. The maple tree stood in the front yard exactly as it always had, its branches catching the early sunlight. When Richard planted it all those years ago, it barely reached the height of the porch railing. Now its shadow stretched across most of the lawn. Time moves quietly, I thought. So quietly that people often fail to notice how much has changed until it is far too late. I dressed simply that morning and made coffee while the neighborhood remained still. At 8 o'clock sharp a truck from Linda's office pulled into the driveway. A young man stepped out carrying a tall white sign with bold black letters across the center. I watched from the kitchen window as he walked across the grass and pressed the metal frame firmly into the soil beside the sidewalk. Then he hung a rectangular panel from 2 small hooks. The words were large enough to read clearly even from the window where I stood. For sale. Beneath the words was Linda Harper's name and phone number. The young man stepped back to inspect his work and then climbed into the truck again. Within a minute he was gone, leaving the sign standing quietly in the morning light. I poured a second cup of coffee and carried it to the living room. From the armchair near the window I could see the sign perfectly. It looked strangely natural there, as if it had always belonged in that spot. A few minutes later my phone rang. It was Linda. She sounded pleased. "Margaret, the listing is live online now," she said. "I have already received 2 inquiries from families asking if they can tour the house later this week." I thanked her and ended the call. The speed of everything surprised me slightly, though perhaps it should not have. Houses close to the lake rarely stayed on the market long. By mid-morning the first curious neighbors began to notice the sign. Mrs. Callahan from across the street paused on her walk and looked at the yard with a puzzled expression. She waved when she saw me through the window. I stepped outside to greet her. "Margaret," she said gently, "I had no idea you were planning to move." "Neither did I until yesterday," I replied with a small smile. She laughed softly, assuming I was joking, and continued on her walk. I stood on the porch watching her disappear down the street before returning inside. The house felt peaceful. Not empty, not sad. Simply peaceful, like a place that had finished serving its purpose. Around noon another call came from Linda. This time her voice carried a note of excitement. "Margaret, we have a family driving over from Columbus this afternoon. They saw the listing and asked if they could visit immediately. They sound very serious." I glanced around the kitchen. The counters were clean. The sunlight filled the room just as it had on countless ordinary afternoons. "That will be fine," I said calmly. "I will be here." After ending the call I walked slowly from room to room once again, noticing the quiet details that had defined so many years of my life. The staircase railing Richard once sanded by hand. The small dent in the wall from Daniel's first attempt at indoor baseball. The worn corner of the carpet near the front door where our dog used to sleep before he passed away. Every object carried a memory. Yet none of those memories belonged to Richard alone. They belonged to me as well. Perhaps more than he ever realized. At 3:30 a dark blue minivan pulled into the driveway. A young couple stepped out along with 2 small children who immediately ran toward the yard with bright curiosity. I opened the door before they even reached the porch. The father introduced himself politely while the children pointed excitedly at the tall maple tree. "Is that tree older than the house?" one of them asked. I smiled gently and shook my head. "No," I said. "It grew up with the family that lived here." Then I stepped aside and invited them in to see the home that my husband believed would always be waiting for him. By the time evening arrived, I had already shown the house to 2 more families, both eager to move forward with their offers. The house that had once felt like a lifetime of memories was now simply a product, being passed along from one family to the next. It was strange, but I didn't feel a pang of sadness. Not yet, at least. Instead, I felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of control over something that had always been his domain. Richard had always made the decisions, assumed he was the one holding the reins. He had never realized how much I had handled, how much I had silently kept together. He had assumed that when he sent that text message, it would mark the end of everything. But he was wrong. I wasn't the one who was ending things. He was. I stood at the window as the last family walked out, their children excitedly discussing where they would put their toys and books in the rooms. The parents smiled, their faces eager, as though they had already imagined the life they would build here. I thought about how quickly everything could change. Just days ago, this house had felt like a prison to me, silent, heavy, full of reminders of a marriage I no longer recognized. But now, it felt like a place of opportunity. A fresh start. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. I didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. Richard's car, unmistakable with its worn paint and dented bumper, rolled slowly to a stop. I took a deep breath, straightened my blouse, and walked to the door. When I opened it, he was standing there, his expression a mix of confusion and annoyance. He had clearly expected things to be the same, for everything to be waiting for him exactly as it always had. But it wasn't. Not anymore. "Margaret," he said, his voice flat, "we need to talk." "About what?" I asked, stepping aside to let him enter. He hesitated, then walked in, glancing around at the empty space, the boxes stacked neatly in the corner, the new reality of a home that no longer held the same place in his life. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, looking at the sign in the yard through the window. "I told you I was coming back. Why did you sell the house?" I closed the door behind him and leaned against it. "I didn't sell it because you asked," I said calmly. "I sold it because it was mine to sell." "You left, Richard. You left me here, and you left everything behind. So now I'm moving on." His face reddened slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "You don't understand. I made a mistake. I wasn't thinking clearly." "Vanessa, Vanessa?" I interrupted, tilting my head slightly. "Is that her name? The woman who's been waiting for you while you ignored everything we built?" Richard looked down at the floor, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Margaret, I'm sorry." No, I cut him off again. "You're not sorry. You're only sorry because you think you've lost control. You've lost the house. You've lost everything you thought was yours to command. But the truth is, Richard, you never owned any of it. Not the house. Not me. You only thought you did." He opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to stop him. "It's too late for apologies, Richard. Too late to pretend this is some misunderstanding. You made your choices. And now, I'm making mine." I could see the anger and the hurt in his eyes. But it was too late for that, too. I had already let go of the person he was, the husband he had become. I had already moved on. "I'm leaving," I said quietly, turning to the hallway. "You can stay. You can leave. It doesn't matter to me anymore. The house is sold. You're free to do whatever you want. But as for me, I'm done." Richard stood there for a long time, his mouth slightly open, not knowing what to say. It didn't matter. I had already said everything that needed to be said. With that, I walked out of the room and into the kitchen, my heart calm, my mind clear. The past was behind me. The future was mine to shape. The next few days passed by in a strange blur of routine, but it wasn't the same routine anymore. I continued to live in the house that was now officially someone else's, but it no longer felt like mine. I had already packed most of my belongings into boxes, taking only what I truly needed. The rest was left behind, a reflection of a life that had already been erased by Richard's choices. I didn't feel regret. Not even sadness. What I felt was a kind of liberation, a slow, steady realization that this house had never truly been my home. It had been his. Everything had been his. As I walked through the rooms, I found myself noticing small things that didn't matter to me anymore. The old vase on the mantel that Richard had insisted we buy because it looked classy, the stack of books that I had carefully arranged in the corner but never really read, the old kitchen chair that had been here before Daniel was born. I ran my fingers lightly along the back of the chair and realized I had never once asked for a new one. I had simply accepted things as they were, as they had always been. But no more. By the time the movers arrived to take the last of my things, I felt like a stranger in my own life. I didn't recognize the woman who stood in the empty living room, staring at the bare walls. I didn't recognize the woman who had spent so many years waiting for Richard to come home, waiting for him to remember her. That woman was gone. The woman who stood there now was someone who had made her own choices, someone who had finally stopped waiting for someone else to decide her fate. The movers carefully loaded the last box into their truck, and I stood on the porch watching them drive away. I had no idea where I was going yet. It didn't matter. The past was behind me now. The future was mine to shape. I turned and walked back inside, shutting the door gently behind me. For the first time in years, the house felt quiet in a way that was peaceful. No more tension, no more waiting. Just silence. But it wasn't an empty silence. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm has passed, when you realize that the damage is done, but you are still standing. I moved toward the back door and stepped out onto the small patio. The maple tree that Richard had planted stood tall and strong, casting a long shadow across the lawn. It had grown much taller than I had ever expected, and it reminded me that things, no matter how impossible they seem, can always change. As I stood there, watching the last rays of sunlight stretch across the yard, I felt a strange sense of peace settle in my chest. I had made it through. I had survived. Richard thought he could leave me behind, thought he could walk away from everything we had built. But he was wrong. I was the one who was walking away, and I was doing it on my own terms. I had built my life. I had built my future. And no one could take that from me. The phone rang in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. It was Linda. I answered, my voice steady, even calm. Margaret, she said, the family who looked at the house last week, the ones from Columbus? They want to make an offer. They're willing to pay full asking price. It's yours, if you want it. I took a deep breath. I had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, it felt like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. Yes, I said simply, I want it. As I ended the call, I looked once more at the maple tree and then turned to face the road ahead. It was wide open now. I was free to go wherever I chose. And for the first time in a long time, I realized I wasn't afraid. The next day, I stood in front of the house, looking at the for sale sign that had been there for only a week. It felt surreal to see it now, knowing that the decision to leave was no longer just a thought in my mind, it was reality. The family from Columbus had made their offer, and just like that, the house that had been part of my life for so long was no longer mine. As I stood there, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For the first time in years, I wasn't holding on to something out of fear or obligation. I was letting go because it was time. Richard thought he could take everything, our home, our memories, our life together, but he couldn't take my peace. I had found it all on my own. I took a deep breath and walked through the front door one last time. The walls felt different now, almost as if they knew they would soon belong to someone else. The furniture was gone, and the space echoed with the memories of laughter and arguments, of quiet mornings and late nights. But it was just a house now. The house we had built together had never been mine. Not really. It had always been his. I moved through the room slowly, touching the surfaces lightly, as if I was saying goodbye to a familiar friend. The kitchen counter where we had made meals for our family. The dining room table where we had celebrated holidays, birthdays, and anniversaries. I ran my hand along the edge of the countertop, feeling the coolness of the stone beneath my fingers. All of it, everything, had been a part of me, but it was no longer a part of my future. It was just a past that needed to be left behind. As I stood in the living room, I heard the sound of tires on gravel. Richard's car. It wasn't a surprise. I had known he would come eventually. But I was ready. I wasn't the same woman who had stood on this same spot just a few days ago, waiting for him to return, hoping that things would go back to how they were. I had changed. I had made my own decision, and I was no longer waiting for him to decide my future. He opened the door without knocking, stepping inside as if nothing had shifted. His eyes scanned the empty room, then landed on me. Margaret, he said, his voice filled with the same familiar tone he always used when he was trying to take control. We need to talk. I looked at him calmly, my expression unreadable. About what? I asked, not even the slightest hint of emotion in my voice. You sold the house, he said, almost as if it was a question. Why would you do that? Why didn't you wait for me? I smiled faintly, but it wasn't a smile of affection. It was a smile of quiet certainty. Because it wasn't yours to keep, I said softly. His expression faltered, confusion flickering in his eyes. He opened his mouth to argue, but I held up my hand, stopping him. No, Richard. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. This house, this life, it's no longer yours. It's mine to do with as I please. His eyes darkened, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flash of anger. But it quickly faded, replaced by something else. Something closer to resignation. You don't understand, he said quietly. I was wrong. I shouldn't have. I shouldn't have done that to you. I was confused. I thought I was still in control. I took a step toward him, my voice firm. You were never in control, Richard. You just thought you were. I looked at him one last time, then turned to walk toward the door. You need to go now. It's over. I watched as he stood there, still trying to process the words I had spoken. But there was no more to say. The decision had been made, and there was nothing left to discuss. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, leaving him standing alone in the house we had once shared. It didn't matter anymore. I had found my freedom. I had found my peace. And it was time to move on. The day after Richard left, I stood in the middle of the living room, looking at the empty space around me. The furniture had been moved out, and the walls, once filled with family pictures and memorabilia, felt bare. There was a strange kind of quiet in the house now, almost like the silence had settled in with me, as if it were part of the decision I had made. I didn't feel sadness. I didn't feel regret. I just felt free. The weight of so many years, so many expectations, so many compromises, all of it had been left behind. I had walked away from that life, but more importantly, I had walked toward something new. The phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the stillness. It was a message from Linda. The family from Columbus had decided to move forward with the sale. They wanted to finalize everything by the end of the week. I smiled to myself, the first real smile I had had in days. I had made the right choice. I had done exactly what needed to be done. I had taken control of my life, of my future, and now it was happening. I sat down at the kitchen table, looking around at the now empty house. It was quiet. Peaceful. But it felt like more than just an empty house. It felt like a place that had served its purpose and now was ready to give way to something new. A new family. A new chapter. A new life. The house would belong to them soon, and in a way, that felt like the last tie to the past had been severed. I wasn't sad about it. I wasn't angry. I simply understood that it was time for everything to change. I had changed. The woman I had been before, the one who had waited for Richard to make decisions, who had patiently put her own needs and desires aside for the sake of the family, was no longer here. I had let go of that version of myself. And in doing so, I had found a freedom I hadn't known was possible. The phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from Daniel. He had been calling and texting since Richard left, checking in, making sure I was okay. I appreciated it, but I didn't need his concern. I was fine. I was more than fine. I was finally becoming the person I had always meant to be. I picked up my phone. And read the message. Mom, I know things have been rough lately, but I just want you to know I'm proud of you. You've always been there for me. Always. I'm here if you need anything. Love, Daniel. I sat there for a moment, feeling a warmth spread through me. My son had always been my biggest supporter. He had always known, deep down, that I was capable of more than just being Richard's wife. I had spent so many years hiding behind the role of the devoted wife, the mother, the caretaker. But now, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing on my own, and it felt good. It felt right. I typed a quick reply to Daniel, telling him I was fine, that I was moving on, and that I loved him. It was the first time I had truly felt at peace with where I was. The phone buzzed once more, and I glanced at it, expecting another message from Linda or maybe Daniel. But it was a call this time. Richard. I hesitated for a moment before answering. I didn't owe him anything anymore. He had made his choice, and now I had made mine. But something inside me told me that it was time to finally end this chapter completely. I swiped to answer. Margaret, Richard's voice came through the line, sounding tired, uncertain. I've been thinking about what you said. About everything. I listened quietly, waiting for him to continue. I know I've made mistakes. I know I hurt you. But I want you to know that I never wanted to lose you. I still care about you. I closed my eyes, taking a slow breath. His words felt empty to me now. I had heard them all before. And I had learned that words meant nothing if they weren't followed by actions. Richard, I said softly, but firmly. It's too late. You had your chance. I've moved on. There was a long silence on the other end. I could almost hear him processing my words, trying to figure out what to say next. But I didn't need him to say anything. I had already said everything that needed to be said. Goodbye, Richard, I said, and then I hung up. I stood there for a moment, letting the finality of the moment wash over me. I had let go. I had moved on. And there was nothing left to hold me back. I was free. The door to my old life had closed, and now the future was wide open. I smiled to myself as I walked toward the door, ready to step out into the world, ready to start again.